Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Regional Studies Association webinar. Delighted to welcome you this afternoon. My name is Sally Hardy, and I'm the Chief Executive of the Regional Studies Association. Before I say any more about the webinar, let me, for the benefit of those of you that don't know us, say a little bit about the Regional Studies Association. So we are the global and interdisciplinary network for urban and regional research, development and policy. We support our members with the latest research, funding schemes, networking, and publishing. And we also provide spaces for researchers and policymakers to grow their careers and to become more familiar with the emerging research topics. As a response to the current global crisis, the RSA board has put in place a number of initiatives to support both our members and the wider community. And these include the Professional Development Webinar Series, this one in fact, but also the Regions, Cities and Industry Webinar Series. We've also launched a small grant scheme for pandemics, regions, cities and industry. We're currently funding 6 projects under that scheme, and we'll be announcing a second and third tranche of funding early in the new year, to keep an eye out for that. All of the details of what we're doing are available on our website. This year, we've also launched a new app. It's called the RSA Hub. It's available from all of the app stores, and it will enable you to network and to get notice and to attend virtual events through the year. It's free to download, and I encourage you to have a look at it. So if we move on to a couple of housekeeping announcements about today's event. This webinar is being recorded and it will be made available to RSA members via the RSA Lounge on our website. Secondly, we anticipate that you will have some questions for our distinguished speaker today. And if you could, please put those into the Q&A box, usually found at the bottom of your screen. I will then pick those up and then relay them to our speaker at the end of her presentation. So let me go on now to say something about our webinar. The title is Grants and Funding, Navigating the Maze, Your Journey from Grant to Open Access Funding, Publishing. Our speaker, our very distinguished speaker, is Vicky Gardner from Taylor and Francis. Vicky is the Director of Policy for TNF. TNF are a publishing house which own the imprint Routledge, and Routledge are the publishers for the association's 5 journals, including our Gold Open Access Journal, and also both of our book series. So we've had a long, enduring and successful relationship with Routledge. Vicky is responsible for delivering the organisation's policy and public affairs strategy, and that includes both internal and external advocacy, horizon scanning and strategic planning. She advises on responses to government consultations, and she sits on the 2 prestigious committees, the Publishers Association Public Affairs Committee and also STM's Policy and Advocacy Committee. This is a really important presentation and webinar from my perspective. What we're seeing within the Academy now is that funders are becoming far more prescriptive about the way in which their grantees can publish their work. So anyone who is taking external funding, this is an important webinar, and there will be lessons to be learned from it. So Vicky, can I now turn over to you and invite you to take the floor? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sally, for the wonderful introduction. I'm delighted to be here today, and thank you to you and the team at the Regional Studies Association for the invitation. So I hope that you can see my screen. As Sally has said, what I'm talking to you today is about the journey, your publication journey, all the way from grant funding through to the publication of your final article. I've called it grant funding to open access publishing, but I hope that the advice and information within this deck will be useful to you regardless of the publication avenue, the publication journey that you embark upon. So we have about 20 minutes where I'll talk to you and go through some slides, and we should have plenty of time at the end for some Q&A. In terms of what I'll cover in this first section, I'd like to do a little bit of Open Access 101, as I've called it here. So there will be a short poll briefly that we'd appreciate your inputs on. I'll then move on to a brief setting of the scene in terms of global policy, with particular focus on policy around scholarly communication, around research and innovation. And within that, I'll try and pick out some broader themes that we're seeing emerging that I think are very useful for you to reflect upon. Then moving on to the meat of the presentation, the practical element, which is about policy to the from policy to the publishing cycle, highlighting some signposts on your journey as you move through the publishing cycle, with a few top tips and some resources. So the aim of today is to equip you with advice to help simplify your publication journey. You may well find that a lot of the advice today is common sense, but it is informed by my own experience and wading through many and varied policy documents. So I hope that it will be useful, even if it is common sense. If there's one takeaway that I'd like to leave you with today, it is this post-it note on the right-hand side of the screen and the 3 top tips. So my top tips to you as you embark on this journey are to know your open access lingo, know your open access terms and definitions, or at the very least know what to look out for. The deck will be shared after the presentation today, and actually at the end of the deck there is a primer that goes into more detail on some of the open access terms and definitions. My next recommendation to you is to note your funding conditions, and ideally note it at the point where you receive approval, where you receive that confirmation of grant funding. I'd suggest that you note them down in bullets, any key points, and keep them somewhere safe to refer back to, because as we all know, there can be a very long time between you receiving your grant funding and the final publication of the output of all of your hard work. Last but by no means least, do check before you submit your work. So, as I say, we are going to make you do a little bit of work before I embark on the presentation. So Alex, if you could share the poll, that would be great. This is anonymous, so don't worry, this isn't a test. It just helps me pitch this session appropriately. And it's also useful to understand as a community what your level of knowledge is and what your level of engagement is, particularly with open access. So the 2 questions that you should be seeing. Firstly, how confident are you in OA nomenclature? So how well do you know your open access terms and definitions? This is a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being very little knowledge, all the way through to 5, you're an expert. And I do apologize for my terrible puns. The second question is a true or false statement. And the statement is open access means making material free online permanently with clear information on how it can be reused. So if you could give us your comments as to whether you think that is true or false. As I say, this isn't a test. It's just really to help us pitch the session. So we'll give you a few seconds to do that. And Alex, perhaps when we have a majority set of responses, if you could share the results, that'd be very helpful. Okay, this is really interesting. Thank you for providing your thoughts. So on the first question, actually the vast majority of the group have no familiarity at all with open access, in which case I will spend a little bit more time just going through 2 of the key definitions. There's a little bit of a spread after that, but you're definitely towards the left of the scale in terms of confidence. So that's useful. Thank you. In terms of the second statement, the vast majority of you have said that that is true. We have a few falses, and we also have 18% saying, I don't know. Again, this is useful just for me to know. So the statement is true, but I will caveat that by saying it is the Taylor and Francis definition. I think, though, broadly speaking, there is nothing that other stakeholders in the research ecosystem would disagree with. The reason that we think that this is the sort of the true definition of open access is because it contains three key elements. Firstly, about making material free online. Secondly, making it available permanently. And thirdly, having clear information on how it can be reused. And the instrument to facilitate that is typically known as a Creative Commons license. You don't need to know the detail of that, but in a nutshell, what that does is it lets third parties looking at work know how they can reuse that work and how they can build on it, which is one of the key possibilities around open access. Very important to note that irrespective of that Creative Commons license and what level is applied, the original creator of the work has to be credited. So that's a common misconception when it comes to that reuse condition around open access. Okay, so I will dwell a little bit on these definitions given the feedback that you've given me. So I'll be talking mostly today around two terms, gold open access and green open access. So to start off today with gold open access, this is about publication of the final article, also known as the version of record, on an open access basis. And what that means, just to go back to that definition, is that the article is made freely available permanently on the journal website. And usually there are clear reuse conditions outlined through application of a Creative Commons license, as I spoke about before. Now, the business model for this route to open access is typically, but not always, something called an article publishing charge, which is paid often after the article has gone through the review process and it's been accepted for publication in the journal, and that's paid by the author, possibly out of a grant. It may be paid by a funder, it may be paid by an institution. It is important to note, though, that this isn't always the mechanism, and increasingly institutions have arrangements directly with publishers that allow you and colleagues to take advantage of this gold open access route without having to incur any charge directly, and actually not having to incur some of the administrative complexity. Before I move on to the second term, I just want to draw your attention to the top right hand where I talk about manuscript versions, just because this is useful again in ensuring that we have a common understanding. So thinking about the cycle from submission through to publication of your work, when we talk about the different manuscript versions throughout this process, at the point of submission, the version that you submit to a journal is typically the author's original manuscript. Once that version has been through the peer review process and it may have been revised, once it's accepted, that becomes known as the accepted manuscript. And then once it's published, as I said at the start, that is the version of record. The reason I wanted to highlight that is because as we move on to the second route to open access and green open access, this typically concerns that accepted manuscript version. So the version that's been through the peer review process, is being accepted by the journal's academic editor post-review. It's often a Word document. It may have track changes on. It's not as beautiful as the final version. So this route to open access, green open access, is about archiving an article in a repository, usually that version, and it's made freely available, but typically this is after a delay, also known as an embargo period. At Taylor & Francis, we do have embargo periods as standard linked to this green open access route, and we often get asked why. Why do we ask people to wait before they make this version available? And that's principally because this route to open access actually depends on the subscription model. So the accepted manuscript is a product of the review process of a subscription journal. So we ask for authors to respect that delay to allow us to recoup the investment in producing that version, typically by selling subscriptions to the journal and to that final version of record. So I hope that's clear, but we do have time to talk about open access in a little bit more detail at the end. So moving on, I wanted to give you a very quick overview of some of the global policy priorities. And you can see here that I very crudely split the world into 5 regions. Very crudely, I hasten to add, and vastly different sizes of region covered. In the interests of time, I won't go into detail in each of these boxes, but what I want you to take away from this slide is an appreciation that there is a lot of focus and there's a lot of policy making at the moment around scholarly communication, around research and around innovation, and a lot of focus for obvious reasons given the current pandemic that we're all living through. But there is some variation in focus and terminology and priorities. Now, very briefly, just to touch on some of those differences, within the UK and Europe, we see a real ambition and a real sort of ideology at play, a desire to be a global leader in terms of setting standards around open access, but also around other areas, innovation and consumer protection. Ethical artificial intelligence is just one example that is very much the focus within Europe. Within China, a lot of focus on strategic innovation linked to the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, whereas in the US, there's a lot of focus on public access. And actually also under the current administration, we have seen a tension between a desire to have academic freedom and also concerns around security, IP, and that America First ideology that I'm sure we're all familiar with. Whether that will still be the case under the Biden administration, I'm fairly doubtful. I think we will start to see things move back to a more collaborative environment. In the global south, we're seeing a slightly different focus again. Here, it's much more about local language to support local communities, and a lot of focus there on really helping local communities address some of the challenges that they're living through. When it comes to open access, the focus here is on community-owned infrastructure, and it's on open access platforms that are typically publicly funded. So lots of diverse approaches, lots of variation in policy priority, as I say, but there are definitely some common values and common themes emerging. And in the box to the bottom left, you can see those highlighted. The first theme is openness. Now, this is open access, but it also covers areas like sharing. So sharing outputs throughout your research process openly. It also covers areas like collaboration. It covers areas like interdisciplinarity. This is a real buzzword amongst funders at the moment in terms of solving some of the grand challenges that we're living through. Another theme is around transparency. Open peer review has been a topic of discussion in publishing circles for many years, but there's been a lot more focus in recent years in terms of the research process on how funders and policymakers can incentivize replication studies, how they can help to solve issues around reproducibility by incentivizing researchers to focus on those areas and to publish null and negative research outcomes. In terms of research assessment, this actually really is a global theme and of great interest and focus globally. And the key point here is that there seems to be consensus that we need to move away from quantitative research assessment measures towards a more qualitative review. And one tool that has emerged recently is an idea of a narrative CV. So researchers submit that as part of their assessment process to their institution, and that allows them to comment on their contribution in a much more holistic way rather than focusing solely on metrics. UKRI have an interesting concept and idea of net contribution, which I think it's worth highlighting to you today, because this isn't just about your contribution to your field of research, it's also you being a good actor in terms of supporting your community, whether that's through peer review or mentoring early career colleagues, ensuring diversity of representation amongst your working groups and in your labs. And I think this point feeds nicely into the last theme or value that I've seen emerging, which is around inclusivity. And I've put here outputs, by which I mean a lot more focus on more than the publication of an article, on outputs prior to that point and after that point, and also a lot more focus on the role of contributors beyond the authors. So the folks who have helped analyze the data, the technicians in the lab, and so on. So I hope that gives you a flavour of some of the themes and some of the complexity. But what does this mean for you as you're sitting, thinking about your work, thinking about where to get it published and thinking about the publication cycle? Can I give you a one-size-fits-all workflow or run through of what this means and the implications of this. I'm afraid not. I'm afraid it's very difficult to translate these ideals and these broad values into a very clear set of instructions for you. And I just wanted to show up these photos from a Universities UK workshop on open access efficiencies and workflow, just to demonstrate some of the complexities here when it comes to translating these points into the publishing cycle. But that said, what I've tried to do is I've tried to take inspiration from the Universities UK approach to, rather than give you a one-size-fits-all guide, give you a series of signposts, give you a series of hints and a series of tips that I hope will guide you and I hope will help you as you think about where to publish your work. So looking at the 4 stages of the publication journey, and starting off on the left-hand side on pre-submission. So 2 points of advice here for you. Firstly, I've said it before and I will say it again, check your funder policy, but I also think it's worth checking your institution's policy here as well. A lot of institutions have a lot of resources and guidance available to their faculty, and indeed have invested a great deal of money in employing staff to help support you. So do take advantage of that. I've put in bold, check with your co-authors, and this is with my publisher hat on, this is with an element of self-interest. It is really important to check with your co-authors and for them to disclose any funding that needs to be linked to your manuscript. That helps us guide you through the process and it helps us avoid any potential issues down the line. Sometimes we don't necessarily find out about funding until later on in the process, so the earlier we know, the better. Moving on to the submission and peer review stage, I should say that I've talked here about journals, but I think these points are useful, whatever publication route you're considering. It might be a monograph, a book chapter, a contribution to an edited collection. So your short list of publication venues, I would definitely suggest that you think about drawing up a list of points against each of them and looking at things like what kind of a journal is it that you're looking at? Is it a hybrid journal or subscription journal, for example? If the journal offers an open access option, that gold open access option that I talked about earlier, is there a charge linked to that and what is it? If the journal has a green open access option, and most do today, do they have an embargo period that they ask you to respect? And what is that? And last but by no means least, what are the license options available to you? Does the journal offer those Creative Commons license options that I talked about earlier? Because many funders do ask you to publish under one of those. So check against your funder policy once you have your shortlist. And I do just want to plug our journal options checker, which hopefully is on your screen now. I think this is useful because it just it provides that information in a structured way. And I've put in here regional studies, regional science. Sally mentioned this journal earlier. It's fully open access. It's a great venue. So do add that to your shortlists. I've put in brackets, moving back to the box, put in brackets to speak to your library about funding. The reason I've put it in brackets is because it might be too early on your publication journey to do this, but nonetheless, I think it is useful if you have the time to do this. Many libraries do make funding available to support open access publication, and many libraries, as I mentioned before, do have agreements directly with publishers, which means that you can go down the gold open access route with very little effort for yourself. So it makes your life a lot easier. And I think if you know about that pre-submission, it really helps. To reiterate my earlier point about co-authorship and checking in with them, please do flag your funding when you submit, because it helps publishers like us make sure that we can route you to appropriate options on your journey. When it comes to acceptance and publication, after you've patted yourself on the back and after you've had your champagne or your fizzy apple juice, think about your options and think about what you'd like to do. So if you're choosing that gold open access route, now is the time for you to request that funding from your library, from your funder, or to use your grant funding, because many funders do allow this as an expense. Publishers, as I mentioned, do help you in terms of making sure that you adhere to your terms and conditions, but it is just worth double checking your license because we're not perfect. If you're choosing the green open access route, so archiving your accepted manuscript, I think at the point when you receive your acceptance note from the academic office, the academic editorial office, it is worth saving a version of your accepted manuscript at that point somewhere safe. And you can set a reminder to upload that to your institution's repository, your institution's website after the embargo period, or you can upload that immediately, and you can set your embargo period as part of that upload process. It depends on your institution's repository makeup. I don't want to forget about the post-publication stage. I know that you'll be thinking about your next project at this stage, but it is important just to do this final piece. So if you are going down the green open access route, if you haven't uploaded your accepted manuscript, do make sure you do that after the relevant embargo period. And for one last time, check your funder policy just to make sure you have complied. I think it's really important to do this because if you go back to that funder in the future to request funding, they will want to see what you've done with previous grant funding and the outputs of that funding. So I've talked about these other points already in the course of the session today, but just to reiterate them. So I'd strongly recommend that once you receive approval from your grant proposal, once you get that agreement through from your funder, your contract, your terms and conditions, have a look through at that point and make a bulleted list of key points. I've put on this slide some of the terms to look out for. You don't necessarily have to be an expert in these terms. I think it's just worth looking out for them at that stage. Make a note of them and you can refer back to them and do your research later. As I've said before, look up your institution's open access policies because many do offer support with funding. And last but by no means least, do make sure that you make use of the support and guidance that's out there. It may be publishers, we have lots of resources, but also RSA has a fantastic set of resources that are tailored to you and your field. So do visit the website. Also look at your funder and your institutional policies. So I'm almost at the end, just to sort of highlight a few resources on this slide. I would like to plug TNF's author services site. We've spent a lot of time and effort putting that together and do hope that's useful. And that also guides you through the publishing process. I've mentioned already Regional Studies, Regional Science, which is fully compliant with all policies and a great venue, and RSA's resources. The other links I think are just very interesting if you have a broader interest in this topic, in policy developments and workflows, etc. But last but not least, I would reiterate the top tips that I started with. Know your open access lingo, or at least know what to look out for. Note your funding conditions at the point when your proposal has been accepted, and take a leaf out of the book of the Girl Guides, the Scouts, of carpenters. Check, and check again. So I think we're over to the Q&A section of today, but I have put a few questions on this slide as well. And if you have any comments or reflections on these three questions, I'd really appreciate hearing your thoughts. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Vicky. That was a really, I think, clear run through from the funder to the point at which you start to publish the results of your research and how you should go about it. And I do have some questions for you, unsurprisingly. The first question is actually from one of our participants, and it takes us back to a kind of a point of first principle, which is why should an author pay to publish? And perhaps the follow-up to that is, do authors always have to pay?
Great question. I think I'll tackle the second part first, if that's okay. Often authors don't have to pay to publish. There are a lot of resources and support out there from institutions and from funders. So that's why I would say it's always worth checking with your institution. And increasingly, as I mentioned as well, a lot of institutions have agreements with publishers, so you don't have to put your hand in your pocket. I think the sort of pay to publish issue is definitely one of the challenges around open access. Open access has huge benefits, it has huge potential. We see huge usage. Anything that's made available on our website as open access, I think receives typically 10 times more views and downloads than that behind a paywall. That said, there is a real risk that in a move towards a more open access environment, it will create inequalities, particularly for disciplines, for regions where there is not a lot of funding. And I think this is one of the challenges around open access at the moment, is that it's very focused on science, technical, medical fields, where there is that real need to make results immediately available. So I think, just to reiterate, often you don't have to pay to publish yourself. That said, I do acknowledge and appreciate that there are challenges with that gold open access model. So I hope that addresses the question.
Thank you. I think that does. I mean, I think it's always worth, just to reiterate the point that you made earlier, looking at what your institution will fund, what your funder will fund. But sometimes, if you're publishing with learned societies, they have waiver funds for people that are unable to access funding. So always ask. Quite often these funds are undersubscribed, which sounds odd, but nevertheless it's true. So I have another question for you here about the diversity of funder policies. Do you think over time we will see an alignment between funders, certainly maybe even just within Europe, but globally later on?
That's a really interesting point. Alignment is certainly the aspiration, and a lot of policymakers themselves have articulated this aspiration to align. What's interesting, though, is that there are some coalitions of funders, and they articulate this aspiration and this intention to align, but when they actually publish their policies, there is variation. And I say this having recently been looking at various funder policies, which at an initial view, you think these are exactly the same, but when it comes to implementation, there are some meaningful differences. So I think alignment, you know, is the ideal. I'm skeptical as to whether it will happen. UNESCO are looking at open science at the moment, and they want to have a global mandate around open science. Note the term science, by the way. But I think whether that will become the case in reality, I'm fairly skeptical, because I just think different fields, different funders, different priorities manifest themselves in different ways when it comes down to the real detail.
Lovely, thank you. We've had a question from a participant come through, which actually it's such a good question. What the participant says is there's been a huge proliferation of predatory open access journals. So journals that are not well edited and are there simply to make money, especially in the global south. Since the Beales list was taken down, and perhaps you could tell people what that is, what resources exist to check whether a journal is legitimate?
That's a really great question. And actually listening to it, it's prompted me to think I need to add another point to that workflow diagram. My advice would be to look at something called Think, Check, Submit, which is an industry initiative. It's our trade bodies, it's various publishers, and it's groups like the Committee on Publication Ethics. It's a really useful resource. It just provides some practical pointers, things to look out for, and what a responsible journal looks like. So Beales list, just for those who aren't familiar, was effectively a blacklist of journals that were potentially predatory or perceived to be predatory. And some of the characteristics of a predatory journal would be, if you look at their journal website, they don't have a clear editorial policy. If you look at the board members, they're not people who are in your field or that you're familiar with. Basic things like lots of typographical errors on the website. In terms of payment, a predatory journal would ask you to pay upfront, that article publishing charge. So there are definitely some points to be aware of, but rather than sort of suggesting that you look at a whitelist or a blacklist, as I say, look at Think, Check, Submit, supported by the Committee on Publication Ethics.
Well, it's really interesting. Thank you for that. I've learned something myself today. I didn't know about that checklist. We've talked a little bit about the way in which people can check whether what their funder wants and whether they can how they get hold of funding. Yeah. But to turn that on its head, how can researchers check whether journals would be compliant with their funders' restrictions? Is there somewhere to go to see whether journals are compliant?
There are some interesting resources out there. for those colleagues based in the UK and Europe, I think Sherpa, SEHRPA, that's a valuable set of tools that allow you to sort of cross-check policies. A lot of funders, including ourselves, we are thinking about how we help you with this sort of compliance checking. So I would also recommend that you have a look at publisher websites. You know, there are other tools out there at an industry level, but they're not necessarily the most accurate. So I'm a bit hesitant to recommend them to you today. My advice really would be, as I said earlier, to note down some of the criteria around your preferred venues, refer back to your bulleted list of funder criteria, and just sort of see if there's any mismatch between the two of them. And I think it is more work for you, but I think it is well worth the effort.
So it's the devil's in the detail, and it's
Yeah.
important to be granular. I agree with that, because the last thing you want to do as a researcher is publish something in a journal that the funder doesn't consider to be compliant, and then imperil your ability to get future research funds. So it really is one. It's like reading the license or the copyright form before you sign it.
Yeah.
Basic good housekeeping.
And sorry, Sally, just to interject, I should have said as well, of course, yeah, absolutely agree with that. And we are very conscious of this. And, you know, in terms of the workflows that we're looking at in our investment, we do want to make sure that if it isn't a compatible venue, that we are recommending other options to you as well. So you're not alone in this. Publishers are thinking really carefully about this, but we can only move at the pace of which the funder policies and the detail is finalised and made available.
Yeah, I agree. It's really tricky at the moment because it's all the policies are coming out in dribs and drabs, and it's quite difficult to be on top of all of it.
Yes.
As the chief exec of a social science learned society, it would be quite surprising if I didn't put this question to you. It seems to myself and our board that a lot of the open access movement is being driven by science, technology, engineering, and maths. And the funders that are focused on those disciplinary areas. And lots of the debate is about advancing science in quite a narrow definition. Do you think that the arts, humanities and social science are being left behind? Do we have sufficient funding? And is there anything that we can do to protect the interests of our community?
Gosh, what a great question. And there are no easy answers, but I think a very bare bones response would be that yes, I agree there is a risk that HSS gets left behind. I think it's very important for learner societies such as RSA to make sure they have a voice, and I'd applaud your efforts, Sally. I think you set a great example to the other heads of learner societies actually in terms of engaging with policy makers on this. But what I'd really like to see as well is researchers realizing their own power and influence, and making sure that they have a voice as well. I appreciate that it's challenging to do that with your funder because you are reliant on them to receive grant funds, but I think nonetheless it's so important for HSS to have a voice. You're absolutely right. HSS receives 10% of the funding that other fields do, and I think that's a generous estimate. So I think there is a real funding issue here. In terms of what publishers are doing, we're all trying to think creatively, and we're trying to come up with new business models that will help HSS to move to open in a way that is feasible. So the article publishing charge model, I don't think is feasible in the long term. We need to come up with the solutions that are. There is no single solution. There is no silver bullet though. So yeah.
Thank you. I agree with that. It's complicated. Everybody, we're running slightly over. I've got two more questions in my hand that I would like to put to Vicky. So please excuse us if we run just a couple of minutes over. So I have quite a fundamental question for you, Vicky. Could you describe the difference between publishing in a hybrid a journal or a gold open access journal from the point of view of a researcher? What difference does it make?
So from a practical standpoint, publishing in a full open access journal is much easier for you. There's less admin burden, so that's great. Anything that is published in a full open access journal is made openly available. So that gold open access route, the final published article, is made openly available as standard. And that's the regional studies, regional science model. The hybrid journals are more complicated, and they were developed as a mechanism to allow you to publish in your preferred journal. So it might be the flagship journal in your field. These are typically traditionally subscription-based journals, and the hybrid, them being hybrid, gives you the option of pursuing that gold open access route, and still being able to publish in your preferred journal. So it is a bit more complicated because from a workflow and a practical standpoint. Gosh, I'm not sure I'd add anything else. Do prompt me, Sally, if I've missed anything. Okay.
That's fine. I have one more question for you. So the Regional Studies Association has a very strong commitment to equality, and we've done a number of things. For example, we use territorial bands for our membership. So if you live in some areas of the world, your membership is one price, and in another area it will be lower. And we do the same for people at different career stages. And we include early career researchers, so we recognise that's a point at which people are setting up their families and their homes and so on, and money is tight. But these questions about equity and access and equality, of course, spill over very clearly into this pandemic run time. We're beginning to do some research on our journals looking at the bulge, the surge in submissions, and whether some parts of our community have been left behind, with the strong suggestion from research that's coming out that people with caring responsibilities had poor pandemics, and people that were able to work freely had good pandemics in terms of clearing their desk of half-written papers. Yes. This spills over, of course, into open access. So are you concerned that there will be parts of our community that may be disadvantaged by a shift to a world in which you need money in order to publish?
Yes, in brief, and I think we're very concerned about, I think, what's been described as the echo effect of COVID amongst certain communities, amongst, for example, female researchers, BAME scholars, BIPOC scholars, Indigenous scholars, early career researchers. So I think this isn't just an issue that relates to open access and funding. I think it's more, it's generally, there need to be changes to research assessment mechanisms to acknowledge that there has been this effect of COVID, and to make sure that some of the new structural inequalities that I think will emerge post-COVID are addressed, but also that we also solve some of the existing problems. And what's heartening to me is that I think funders and policymakers are becoming increasingly conscious of that and conscious of their responsibility and accountability. And it harks back to the point in the slide around transparency. I think it's really encouraging to see funders and policymakers saying, yes, we need to be more open about the decision-making process that we go through when it comes to giving out grants, and calling on institutions to do the same when it comes to hiring practices. So I didn't quite answer your question, but I hope that was useful.
I thank you very much. I think you did answer my question. I am going to draw the webinar to a close now, but I would like to say to all of you who are participating, I know something about Vicky's slide deck that you don't know, because I've had the benefit of seeing it beforehand, and we will circulate it after this meeting. And behind the slides that you've seen, there are several other slides that give more information that will be available to you. I'd like to thank you, Vicky, so much for that presentation. You prepared it beautifully, you delivered it beautifully clearly, and it is a very, very complicated topic. I'd like to thank my colleagues who are hosting and doing the tech support for this series. You've been stars all year, and I really do want to publicly acknowledge the work that my colleagues have done in pivoting us from face-to-face into this virtual and digital world. And finally, of course, I would like to thank the people that have joined us today and have made it so interesting by asking such great questions. And we're grateful to have you with us. Please check out our website and please join our community. So thank you very much indeed, and goodbye.
Thank you.